So we last week we looked at the northern, what I call the northern campaign, which was the war against the Canaanite forces in the north. If you remember, where's that map? Oh, I didn't put that map up here. It's in here. If you remember, after the battle in the south, Yehoshua had come back to Gilgal, and there he got word. God told him that the kings in the north, Chatzor, and all the kings and the Canaanite kings in the north were gathering a massive army to wage war against Yehoshua. And so Yehoshua takes his army in the middle of the night, maybe over a few nights, it's not clear, but he does go back to the beginning of the parak. Vayomer Hashem al Yehoshua al tira mipnehem, don't be afraid. God says to Yehoshua, Machar eit kazot anochi noten et kulam chalalim lifnei Yisrael. By tomorrow they will all be gone. Yehoshua takes his entire people. Vayavo Yehoshua b'chol am hamilchama imo alehem al mei marom pitom, and he takes them all the way up north into Mei Marom, right south of Chatzor, where the armies were gathering, and he does so suddenly, meaning in a secret move. He moves the camp by Bahem, and using the element of surprise, he attacks them before they have a chance to gather together and to launch their campaign. Vayitnem Hashem b'yad Yisrael vayakum, and they smite them. Vayirdefum, they chase them ad Tzidon haba, all the way out to Tzidon, which is up here in the north. They push them out to the north. They push them out to the east, and essentially end that battle. And then there's a lot of cleanup that takes place. I'm going to skip that for now, and we're going to move to the end of the parak. Let's start with pasuk Tet Vav. Kasher tziva Hashem et Moshe avdo, ken tziva Moshe et Yehoshua, v'chein asa Yehoshua lo yisir davar mikol asher tziva Hashem et Moshe. It's kind of a summary statement of God that Moshe had commanded Yehoshua, and Yehoshua successfully had done all that Moshe had instructed him. Veikach Yehoshua et kol haaretz hazot. These last psukim sort of form a summary of the entire campaign of the conquest of Canaan. Yehoshua took all of this land, Hahar, Ve'et kol Negev, the hill, the Negev, the south, Ve'et kol Eretz HaGoshen, and we talked about the land of Goshen here is different from Goshen and Mitzrayim, but it's most likely a reference to the southern Negev all the way up to the beginning of the Sinai. Ve'et HaShvela, the coast, Ve'et HaArava, and the Arava and the valley of the Jordan Valley, Bet Har Yisrael, the central region, the mountain of Israel, Ushvelato, and the lowland of the mountains. Min Har HaChalak Ha'oles Seir Ve'ad Ba'al Gad B'Bik'at Levanon, all the way from south by Seir or the Negev, all the way up to Lebanon and the Hermon, Tachat HaChamon, Vet Kol Machehem Lachad Vayakem V'Yimitem. And he smote all of the kings and conquered the land. Yehoshua made these campaigns took time. We read them in a couple of sessions. They formulate them in the Sefer. They're in 5 chapters, 6, 7. Chapter 6 is Yericho, chapter 7 and 8 is Ai, chapter 9 is the Giv'on, chapter 10 is the southern campaign, chapter 11 is the northern campaign. For us, it's a handful of chapters, but in fact, it's Yamim Rabim. As I'll say, it took 7 years for the conquest of Yehoshua. Many days or many years. Et kol ha-melachim ba'elam milcham. Lo hayta ir asher hishlima el bnei Yisrael bilti hachivi yoshvei Giv'on. There was no city that made peace with Israel, with the exception of the Givonim. They all fought against Israel, and Israel had to fight back, and they took their land. This was by divine instruction or implementation. God hardened their hearts, that they should try to fight against Israel, so that in the end they would lose. Not to have any favor in the land, this land was now being transferred to Israel. ויבוא יהושע בעת ההיא, ויכרת את הענקים מן ההר. Yehoshua cut off the anakim. Anakim are typically defined as giants, but there's some sort of group of warriors and fighters, very tall, very strong, very scary, if you will. Most famous amongst them, I'll tell you in a moment. Yehoshua goes and he conquers them as well. Min Hahar min Chevron, the four anakim of Chevron give the name of in the Chumash to Kiryat Arba. There are four anakim that were there. Min Dvir, min Anav, umikol Har Yehuda. We talked about the battle with Dvir. Har Yehuda, mikol Har Yisrael. Im arehem hechrimam Yehoshua. Lo nata anakim be'eretz b'nei Yisrael. There were no anakim left in the land, with the exception of rak ba'aza b'gatu ba'ashdod nisharu. Anakim, the only place the anakim were left were Aza, Gat, and Ashdod. These are the Philistine cities, the Arei Plishtim. Most famous amongst them in this case would be the Anak, or the giant from Gat. Most famous giant from the city of Gat is
Goliath.
Goliath Plishti, correct. Veikach Yehoshua et kol haaretz k'chol asher diber Hashem et Moshe. Yehoshua took all of the land. Vayitna Yehoshua lenachala liYisrael, and he gave it to Israel to divide up by tribe as an inheritance. Kimachlokotam l'shivtehem, according to the divisions in the tribes. Ve'haaretz shakta mimilchama, and then the land rested from war. The battle was won. And the next chapter, which I'm just going to show you briefly, we'll study it next week in more detail. This is sort of a summary of the kings and the cities that Israel conquered under Yehoshua's leadership. Again, we have the various geographic regions, etc., etc. And then you have the list of the kings: Melech Yericho Echad, Melech Ai Echad, Melech Beit El Echad, Melech Yerushalayim, Melech Hebron, Yarmut, Lachish, Eglon, and Gezer. This is a whole, we'll talk about its structure, but this is a whole, if you can see it so easily, okay. This is a whole song or a shira of the victory of Israel against the Canaanites. And that's sort of the summary of the end of the first half of the Sefer. So we've really reached, in this discussion, a kind of a transition point, the end of the first half of the book, which is all the conquests and the battles of Yehoshua. But after the Shira, which we'll look at next week, the next parak begins, Yehoshua Zaken Ba Bayamim. Yehoshua is old, and it's time to kind of look at what's going to be in a post-Yehoshua world. So from our perspective, we've really reached the end of the story of Yehoshua's leadership and Yehoshua's conquest. So it's a good opportunity for us, in this parak in particular, to kind of take a step back and to explore and to kind of review where are we at in the book. What have we seen, and where are we going? What transition, what messages have come out of our study, particularly of the four major campaigns of Yehoshua: Yericho, Ai, the southern campaign, and the northern campaign. And that's what I wanted to look at today's shir, kind of to use these psukim as a kind of a jumping board to a question of a review of the whole picture. So, and because some of this is not text-based, it's sort of just summary, I'm going to just stop sharing for a moment just so I can see everybody. I'll come back to sharing my screen momentarily. But what I wanted to kind of take a look at is a critical transition that's taking place in each step, each iteration of these campaigns, because they're very different. If we think back to Yehoshua, to the Battle of Yericho, and then the Battle of Ai, and then the Battle of the South, the Brit with the Givonim, each one of these sets up a different kind of campaign. And looking at them in a kind of an arc or a transition conveys a couple of very important messages for us. So let's do a quick review. First, the military campaign that Yehoshua engages in after he crosses over the Yarden is the Battle of Yericho. And if we look at the four major campaigns from the perspective of what role does God play in each of these battles, and what role does Yehoshua and the army play in each of these battles, very interesting transition emerges. In the Battle of Yericho, there's no question, when you remember the famous story of Yehoshua standing outside the city of Yericho, and he sees an angel standing there with the sword drawn, and he says to him, Lanu atam letzavenu, are you for us or against us? And he says, Sar tzva Hashem anochi, I am the ministering angel of God's army. I am the chief of God's army of angels. Tabati, I've come now for Yericho. I've come for the battle of Yericho. And in that campaign, the role of the Nisan, the role of the miracles, the role of God in that campaign really was front and center. God planned, he gave Yehoshua the instructions about how to take down the wall, about how to surround the city, how to blow the trumpets, etc. The entire military strategy of Yericho was given to Yehoshua in Perek Vav by God. If you remember the psukim, I'll just actually go back to sharing for a moment. Let's just go back to keep these. There's nobody going in. Yericho is totally surrounded. Vayomer Hashem al Yehoshua. God says to Yeshua, I've given Yericho into your hands and its king. You'll surround the city, and you'll do this, and you'll take 7 kohanim, and 7 shofarot, and you'll blow the shofars for 7 days. Each time you do 1 hakafah, then you do 7 hakafot on the 7th day. All planned by God. And only after the trumpets blow, then the walls come down, and then God says, now go and conquer the city. So there's no question that the entire operation is planned by God. The miracle is extraordinary. The miracle of the walls coming down of Yericho are very similar, and we talked about the parallels to Mount Sinai with the sounds of the shofar and the 7 days, and after the 7 days, b'imshoch b'keren hayovel v'kishamachem et kol hashofar. Verses that sound very much like Mount Sinai. After the walls come, alu ha'am ishnegdo, the people should go into the city. Right? B'imshoch hayovel hema yalu bahar. When you blow the shofar, they should go up the mountain. This is exactly the parallel to Mount Sinai and the miracle in that extraordinary context. And the miracle of the Battle of Yericho really had 2 purposes. One was to enable them to go in to fight the war, to be able to go in and fight Yericho, to deal with the tactical challenge of the walls of the city. And that becomes a recurring theme in Yehoshua, how to get the army out of the walls or how to conquer the walls. In the case of Yericho, God says, I'll conquer the wall. But in all the other battles, Yehoshua has to strategize how to bring the army out of the protection of the walls, because the walls themselves are a tactical challenge for Yehoshua. But the other reason for breaking or for felling the walls of Yericho, for bringing them down, we actually didn't discuss at the time. I think it's important to note that it enables something else, which is that while Yehoshua's army enters Yericho for the purpose of conquest, by bringing the walls down and ending the siege, it also enables the Canaanites who want to, like Rachav, who sides with Israel, or those who may not side with Israel, but not want to engage in the fight, to be able to flee. Because the moment the walls come down, they're no longer surrounded and besieged. Now the enemy can flee as well. And that's actually very interesting halach. The Rambam formulates this in the laws of kings, the wars of kings, and he says, when you siege a city to conquer it, you can't besiege it on all 4 sides, only on 3 sides. Because you need a place left for those who want to flee if they so desire it. And then he quotes psukim for this. There's a very simple tactical reason for this halacha, which is that an enemy that feels they have no choice, they've been cornered and they have nowhere to go except to fight, will fight till the end. Whereas if you leave them a way to run, then you create the option for them to do so. That also is part of this operation. So all of that is God's plan, God's execution. God brings down the walls. It's probably the next to the splitting of the Yarden, which was parallel to Mammon to create Yam Suf, probably the greatest miracle in the book. We'll talk about the sun in Givon in a moment. And all of this in order to support the army as it enters Yericho. One of the things that we learned from this campaign was that Yehoshua doesn't have the authority to take of the spoils of war, because this battle of Yericho, God fought. And God says to him, essentially, this therefore becomes cherem Hashem. It becomes forbidden to take of the spoils. This was God's battle. Now you need to start this campaign. And why that is necessary, we'll see in this year, we'll see in a moment why that story takes place. Perek Zayin shifts our attention to the Battle of Ai. And there's a sub-story in the Battle of Ai, which is Achan's violation of the Cherem of Yericho. But the main story in the Battle of Ai was that there were two battles of Ai, Perek Zayin and Perek Chet. In Perek Zayin, Yehoshua is told by a series of spies that Ai is easy to take, easy pickings. Don't send the whole army, just take 2,000 or 3,000 and you'll be fine. And they are defeated. They are defeated physically, defeated morally. It's a massive defeat. The entire delegation that they send to Ai is defeated. It's the first major defeat since the Battle of Amalek, really. And it causes Yehoshua great heartache. He tears his garments, etc. So the result is twofold. God has to point out to him that this defeat was by God's plan, because they violated the Cherem of Yericho, because there was a kind of an arrogance that emerged after the easy, quote unquote, victory at Yericho, where they thought that they were the victors. They kind of looked at Ai and said, okay, this is too easy for us. We don't need to worry about it. And God says to him, that's not correct. So the entire campaign, the entire first episode with Ai, is orchestrated by God as a punishment for both the arrogance in belittling the campaign of Canaan, as well as the arrogance of Achan's violation of the Cherem of Yericho. And that leads to Perek Chet, where God plans the second stage of the battle. Yomer Hashem el Yehoshua, al tira, al tichat. This time take the whole people, kach et imcha et kol am milchama, and you will wage a battle with Ai the second time. An ambush, you'll bring them out, they'll chase after you, they'll think they've won, and then you'll turn and fight them, etc. But this was all by God's plan. So if I look at our variables, how much is, who's designing the battle plan? What role God is playing, executing the campaign. In the Battle of Ai, God orchestrates the entire battle. He designs the battle plans. He implements it. Right? This is an entire battle carried out by the army of God, Sar Tzva Hashem, that angel that Yehoshua sees. Ai is a little different. On the one hand, there is the Perek Zayin, which is the fall, the defeat at Ai, but that also is orchestrated by God. And God is the one who causes them to be defeated at Ai for various reasons that are internal to the story. But at the end, when they actually implemented the second step of the campaign against Ai, God instructs Yehoshua to lead the campaign. And so they do. So there's certainly God's role in the story. There's also Yehoshua's campaign in the story. And that leads us to Perek Tet, first half of the Perek, which is the Brit with the Givonim. In response to the Brit with the Givonim, we have the third military campaign, which is, of course, the campaign of the kings of the south. And that's the famous story of Shemesh Begivondom, which which we explained in various ways. But here, the Brit with the campaign of the south, Yehoshua hears, if you go to the moment in which all of the armies come against Givon, the people of Givon send a message to Yehoshua. And they say, come and help us. There's no conversation here with God. But Yehoshua and his people take their army and they go. And then Yehoshua says to him, God says to you, then God says to Yeshua, Vayomer Hashem al Yeshua, al tiramehem. Don't be afraid of them. I will give them into your hands. And so here you have Yeshua designing the battle plan, the strategic thinking, Yeshua pitom, of Yeshua taking the army and launching a surprise attack, moving the army all night long, Kol halayla, alamina Gilgal, to take the army from Gilgal to Givon all through the night and launch a surprise attack. There's no instruction there. Yeshua, this is Yeshua strategizing. This is Yeshua military tactics, military skill with the army. But God's certainly involved. Yehumim Hashem lifnei Yisrael v'yakem akad g'dolah b'Givon. God smote the enemy. God smote the Canaanites. And there is this, as they're fleeing, as they're running, God is pouring down stones or hailstones upon the enemy, like artillery backup. If I had to define God's role in this battle, I would say it's artillery backup to the army of Yehoshua. And then there's a second role in God's hand in this campaign, and that is when you start to hear Yeshua's song, Az Yedaber Yeshua L'Hashem, you hear Yeshua talk about Shemesh b'Givon Dom Yareach me'emek Ayalon, the sun standing still, Givon and the moon in Emek Ayalon. And the way we explain that this is Shira, this is poetry, this is song of victory, this isn't about the miracle, because that would completely negate the very message of the Sefer. But rather, this is the way we described it, which is along the lines of the Rabbi, and here you see how important that insight of the Rabbi is, that as Yeshua is fighting the enemy in the Canaanites, and he says to the people, he says to them several places, Al ta'amodu, don't stand, ridfu, achrei bechem, fight, go chase, go, don't let them go back to their cities, al titnum lavo al arehem. That's Yeshua's primary concern. They shouldn't escape back into the walls. And so the backup here is artillery backup, stones from heaven, hail from heaven, and illumination of the battlefield. Now, whether that illumination of the battlefield is in the form of some miraculous light that, like Kriyat Yamsuf, or what the Rabbi suggests is that there was a tefillah. Yeshua was asking God to enable them to defeat their enemies within the day, that day, not to let the campaign go past the night, as if they were able to do much more, like Fitzat Derech, do much more during the day than would ordinarily be possible, as if the day was longer. Shemesh b'Givon Dom v'Yareach be'emek Ayalon. That was the Rabbi. And then Yeshua sings song of victory of Shira in that regard. And that brings us to Perek Yud Aleph, which is the Perek we're finishing today. And here, all the kings of the north are gathered together. The kings of the north are concerned for Yeshua's success. They gather all together. They're going to launch a massive campaign against Yeshua. And God's role in this battle is particularly interesting because, unlike in all the other campaigns that Yeshua has fought up until this point, there's been some direct involvement of God in the campaign. The role God plays in Perek Yud Aleph is the role of, I would say, military intelligence. Meaning he informs Yehoshua, Vayomer Hashem al Yehoshua, al tirah mipnehem, don't be afraid, because tomorrow this army will be in your hands. And he gives them a mitzvah. He tells them they have to destroy the horses. But the campaign strategy, to take the army, to move north, and to move north silently, and to do so in a campaign that launches a surprise attack that takes out the enemy's campaign before they have a chance to organize. That is all Yeshua's campaign. And there's no miracle here. God helps them. But and they smite them and they chase after them. But there's no miracle. There's no hail. There's no illumination. There's no shemesh b'Givon Dom. Right? This is Yeshua and the army of Israel fighting the war as they need to, and God says to him, I will be with you. And that is so if I take a look at these four campaigns, and I look at them from the vantage point of God's intervention and role in each battle, assuming you adopt the interpretation of the Ralbag on the sun standing still in Givon, right? That's the big variable here. What emerges is a diminishing role of overt miracles by God and an increasing role of Yehoshua and the army of Israel in a very linear fashion. From Yericho to the two battles of Ai, the first God causes them to be defeated, and the second as a punishment, and the second God plans out the campaign against Ai. To the southern campaign where God assists artillery backup from the heavens and illumination of the battlefield. God assists backup. To the fourth, where you don't see God's role at all, except in the communication between God and Yehoshua, like the Modi'in. And what emerges is, if I consider this from an educational standpoint, it's almost as if the instructions are designed to wean Yehoshua and the people of Israel off the reliance on the miraculous, supernatural nature kind of miracles we saw in Yetziat Mitzrayim. There's almost this effort to diminish the role of God in each campaign. That's not an accident. That's very intentional. That's the core message of Sefer Yehoshua. And it was that message that they carried with them from the time they left Mitzrayim. That the goal is to wean them off the reliance on the miracles of God and to fight for themselves and to defend themselves, never to abandon God, not to say that it's my victory, but rather to say Hallel at the end. But the notion that we wean the people off of those miracles, that's the sequence of events in the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, from the Makat B'Chavot, Kriyat Yam Suf, Ma'amar Sinai, to the campaign with Amalek, to the campaign with Og and Sichon. I'll show you that in a moment. That's the weaning process that's taking place here as well. From Yericho to Ai, to the south, to the north. And in each step, there's less of a role of God's miracles than there was before. And that, I think, is intentional. That's the core message of the book of Yehoshua, or the first half of it. I shared this idea with you before in a different context. If you, when we studied Yehoshua, we talked about the spoils and whether they were entitled to the spoils, and I shared with you at the time a very powerful medrash that summarizes this whole idea in a different context. It's a medrash actually in Eicha Rabbah, and about the four kings that led from David HaMelech to the Churban. This is the same source that I shared with you at the time. I've just copied it here to kind of refresh our memory. But it's exactly the same four stages that we see in Yetziat Mitzrayim and we see here in Yehoshua, except that it's in reverse order. Here we're going from less engagement of God to more engagement of God. And the Medrash puts it in very clear terms that this is a negative. The more God is involved in our lives, the more there's overt miracles involved in the story of Israel, the worse we are. It's probably counterintuitive, but that's the way the Medrash depicts it. Zavdi ben Levi patach. Lo heminu malchei eretz arba malachim hayu. There's a pasuk in Eicha. There were four kings in the story of Jewish history, Tanakh history, from David to Chizkiyahu. Each one had a different request, meaning a lesser, well, we'll see what it means. David asa Yoshaphat and Chizkiyahu. Now, understand, David is, of course, the paradigm of Malchut Yisrael. Asa and Yoshaphat, father and son, a couple of iterations into the kingdom of Judah. And Chizkiyahu is the last grandfather of Manasseh. Chizkiyahu is sort of the end of the last great hope, great kings. There's one more great king after Chizkiyahu, Yoshiyahu. But for all intents and purposes, Chizkiyahu is the last major military power in the region. David Amar, what was the character? What defined the sequence from David to Chizkiyahu? David said, "Irdof avai v'asigem." I will pursue my enemies and I will chase them. That's a pasuk in Tehillim, Shirat David, in David's song of victory, thanksgiving to God for all of his victories. Amalo Kadosh Baruch Hu ani oseh, so God said, so be it. And so it says, Vayakem David me'aneshef yad ha'erev l'mochotam. David smote them from morning till evening the next day, evening till this is from twilight till the evening of the next day, 24 hours. This was against the battle of Amalek, part 2, at the end of Shmuel Aleph. The message here being that not only in this battle, but in all of David's battles, there is not a single moment in David's military campaign, any of his campaigns, in which there is a description of any overt miracles or hand of God. David fought his battles till the very end, and David was victorious. When he was victorious, he attributed that victory to God. That's the key message. Ahmad Asa, and Asa says, and I'll show you the psukim in a moment, Ani ein bi koch lavod. I don't have the strength to fight, to go in for the kill. I don't have the strength to actually slay my enemies. Meaning, God, are diminished in our strength. We're one step down the ladder. Therefore, Ani odef otem, I'll chase them. But when it comes to the final battle, Atao said, God, we need your help. So God says, fine, so be it. Vayir defem Asa. And the pasuk here in Divrei Hayamim, I'll show you in a moment, says that Asa chased them. And they fell before God and before his army. It doesn't say that Asa chased and they fell before Asa, but rather it says that they fell before God. I'll show you those psukim in a second. Actually, you know what? I might as well show you them now, so you'll understand what's going on. I apologize for not having translation in this. You can look them up in the Tanakh. But this is David HaMelech in Shirat David. I will destroy my enemies, and you will enable me to do so. And David smote them from evening till evening the next day. And he took up the spoils of war, which is what we looked at last time. And there's a lot of discussion about the spoils of war in that battle. Asa sees this great army of Kushi, Zerach HaKushi, who comes out with an army of 1,000,000 soldiers and horses and chariots. Vayetze Asa lefanav. Asa goes to fight. Vayikra Asa Hashem, and he calls out to God, and he says, Ein imcha la'azor ben rav le'en koach. God, you can help, whether we have many or whether we are lacking strength. You have the ability to help. Ozreinu, help us. Ki alech nishanav, who will rely on you. Help us. Remember that word, Ozreinu, because we're going to see the sequence here from Ozer to Moshiach to Magen. And if you add David as Melech, that sequence that we say in the Shemona Esrei every day, Melech, Ozer, Moshiach, Magen, is exactly this sequence. Ozreinu, help us, but to help means we do and you help. And it says in Pasuk Yud, Vayir defem Asa chased them, and Vayiplu mikushim le'en le'mechya ki nishberu lifnei Hashem v'lifnei machaneu. They were successful because they fell before God and before his army. And he smote all of the nations there. Ki pachad Hashem alehem, God's fear upon them. So what role God had here, it doesn't say, but clearly he had a role in this miracle much more overtly than in the case of David. That's part 2. Then we come to Yehoshaphat, next generation. Amar Yehoshaphat v'amar, ein bi koch. I don't have the strength. Lo laharog v'lo lirdof. I can't fight and I can't chase. Ella, you know what, God? Ani omer shira. I'll sing. I'll say Tehillim. I'll pray. I'll daven. And tell you God, take out my enemies. Kadosh Baruch Hu says, fine. And the pasuk reads, now the Neviim in the Beit HaMikdash began to pray and to offer Tehillim. Natan Hashem me'orvim al bnei Ammon and Moab. God placed ambushes before Ammon and Moab and smote them. This too is in Divrei Hayomim. In the case of Yehoshaphat, I'm not going to read all of it. I just want to show you a piece. And the Ammon and Moab came against the people of Israel to war. They came and they told Yehoshaphat that there's an extraordinarily large army, Hamon Rav, on the other side of the Yam, from Aram, which was the major empire to the north. And he calls a fast day, Vayikrat Tzom, and he offers a tefillah, and he stands at the Beit HaMikdash, and he says, right, in the case of Asa, he was on the battlefield when he prayed. Yehoshaphat is in the Beit HaMikdash, and he says, God, Atahu Elokim b'shamayim, Ata Moshe b'kol, you reign over all, u'biyadcha koach u'gvura. You, God, have the strength. You can do whatever you want. And therefore, we are helpless against this enemy. We cry out to you, you shall hear, v'tishma, v'toshia, you save us. Asa prayed that God should help us. Yehoshaphat prays that God should save us. There's a greater involvement on God's part to save us than to help us. Right? Depends on how much role you're playing yourself. And that's exactly what it says, they're coming against us to chase us from our land. We don't have the strength behind this before this great multitude. We don't know what to do. You do it for us. And God's answer, Atem al tiru, don't be afraid. Al tichatu, don't be dismayed. You do not need to fight them. God will fight them. You don't have to fight. Stand, watch. Watch God save you. Exactly the same language you have by Kriyat Yamsuf. And that's exactly what happens as they begin to sing Hallel Hashem, and Ve'aminu b'Hashem u'Moshe Avdo, and they trusted God, and they had great amunah from God, etc. As they began to pray and to sing, God smote Ammon and Moab. How? It doesn't tell us what the nature of the miracle is, but you could see from the language that there's a much greater distress and a much greater role for God to play and for Yehoshaphat to play, as army to play less of a role. And that brings us to step 4. Amad Chizkiyahu ve'amar, famous story of the siege of Yerushalayim, Sancheriv standing on the outside of Yerushalayim. And he says, Ein bikoch, I don't have the strength. And that phrase, Ein bikoch, appears in each one of these iterations. Lo larog, lo lirdof, lo lamar shira, I don't have the strength to fight or to chase or to even sing shira. I'm going to sleep in the middle of my bed in the middle of the night. And God, Betal said, you take care of my enemies for us. As it says, and that night an angel went out and smote the Machane Ashur, just like by Yericho. An angel came, God's army, and smote the enemy. And that's exactly what you have. And Chizkiyahu's description of Ba'u Banim ad Mashper b'koach en laledah. We've reached the birthstone, but we don't have the strength to birth the baby, meaning we are helpless. And therefore, God not just save us, not just help us, but protect us. And the language here used is Lo yekadmenu magen. God will protect this city. No sword will come against it. V'ganoti et ala irazot lo shia. I will protect this city. And so Malach Hashem goes out in the middle of the night, smites the kingdom of Ashur, 185,000. In the morning, they're all gone. That's Melech, Ozer, Umoshia, Umagen. That's the sequence. Magen, going backwards by Chizkiyahu. Yehoshaphat is Moshiach, to save us. Asa is Ozreinu, help us. Melech, and David, of course, is David HaMelech. However, this message isn't a positive message. The more God is involved, the better it is. It's a negative message. It's a reflection of ein bikoch. The less strength we have, the more we have to rely on God. Chizkiyahu is 100 years away from the Churban of the Beit HaMikdash and the fall of the kingdom. The story of Chizkiyahu is a story with great pain, with great price we paid for that victory. And that's the key message. If we go from Chizkiyahu to Yehoshaphat to Asa to David, if we go backwards, the same sequence happens in Yetziat Mitzrayim, except in reverse order. In Makat B'chorot, like Chizkiyahu sleeping on his bed in the middle of the night, Atem lo tetzu ish b'petach beito, we are not allowed to go out in the middle of the night, we're not allowed to even see Makat B'chorot. God fought the Egyptians in the plague of the firstborn. To the story of Kriyat Yamsuf, where Hashem yilachem lachem atem tacharishun, God will fight for you, but you will be silent. But right, see the victory of God, but we could watch. We were zocheh to be part of it. We had to walk into the sea. We had a role, and we could sing Shira. To the battle of Amalek, where God says to Yehoshua, "Go and build an army." But then he takes the staff and he stands on the mountain and he lifts the staff, much like by Givon, where there's artillery backup and there's illumination backup, right? There's the staff of God. There's feathers chasing the enemy, but Hashem's staff is there for the final blow, like Asa. And then the final battle that Moshe leads Bnei Yisrael to fight is Sichon and Og. And in Sichon and Og, there are no miracles. This God says to Moshe, go and fight against Sichon, go and fight against Og. There's no description of the staff or the description of God standing. They fought against an enemy, a vicious enemy, and they won. And the sequence from Makat Bechorot, Kriyat Yamsuf, Amalek, and Sichon is the exact reversal of the sequence of Chizkiyahu, Yehoshaphat, Asa, and David, the role of God in the campaign, which is decreasing versus increasing. And that's exactly what happens by Yehoshua. Next generation, they come into the land of Israel, and there's an entire repeat of the sequence of Yetziat Mitzrayim. From Kriyat Yamsuf, we go to Kriyat Yarden, and then we start one battle after another. Yericho parallels Kriyat Makat B'chorot. God fights this battle. You don't even have the right to take the spoils of war. God is involved. Step causes our defeat. We pray to God. There's a chet, there's an onish, direct involvement of God. There's a goral, but at the same time, God's planning the battle, but we fought the battle at the end. That's step 2. Step 3, illumination, backup, artillery from heaven. There's roles of God to play, but much more role for Israel. And in step 4, in the final battle of chapter 11, there's no role of God other than to say to Yehoshua, go and fight this, I will help you, and to trust God. That's exactly what happened. So that's the sequence, the same sequence that we saw in Yetziat Mitzrayim, the same sequence the Medrash describes in the aftermath of that led to the Churban. In Yehoshua, that's the message of the Sefer. It's time to wean the people off of the reliance on God's open miracles, to do more themselves. The more we do ourselves, and God supports us, the better off we are, the stronger we are spiritually. It's counterintuitive because we think if there are miracles, great. But the answer is no. The more God says, here's my hand, here are the miracles, the more we rely on those miracles. And when they're not there, we have a crisis of faith and we lose heart. And it's exactly the opposite of what we might think. And that's the message of Yehoshua. Okay, that's sort of a summary of the 4 major battles of the campaign. In the remaining 12 minutes that we have, I want to take a slightly deeper dive into these psukim. And to do so, a couple of principles or strategies of Yehoshua's campaign that are important to recognize. The first is that every time they finish the campaign, where does the camp of Israel go? They conquer the south. Several times in the text it says the camp returns to, the army returned to the camp in Gilgal. They conquer they return to Gilgal. They conquer the north, they return to Gilgal. Every military campaign ends with the camp in Gilgal because the people are fighting as one. Yehoshua has led the army of Israel. The army of Israel is based in Gilgal. Gilgal is a very strategic location. It's right, I'll show you the map. It's right here as just south of Yericho, as they entered across the Jordan. Here they established their camp, and from here they're able to conquer from here they're able to conquer the south. From here they're able to move their army north. But when they're done, they come back to base camp in Gilgal. This will become very important for us in the second half of the Sefer. That's principle number one. Yehoshua is leading a national army. The headquarters of that army is in Gilgal. Number two, which we've talked about, the strategic importance for Yehoshua to conquer quickly because he doesn't want the armies of Canaan to unite, and to find ways of bringing the army outside of the cities so that one by one he can engage them in open territory. That sometimes means that in the midst of a campaign, we need to fight quickly in order to not to let the enemy reestablish its strategic defenses in the walls of the city. Take the battle to the field of the enemy. And the third principle is not to let them come to Gilgal, not to let the enemies attack in Gilgal, but to be on the constant offensive and to reach out when necessary to launch the campaign against the north or the south, but don't let the enemy encroach on their headquarters in Gilgal. To do that, he cuts across the country in the middle from Yericho to Ai, essentially cutting the north and the south off from each other, opening himself up to a multi-front campaign. He's got a front now in the south and a front now in the north. But that's okay, because even though a multi-front campaign is a challenge for Yehoshua, it's more important to gain the strategic control over the central high ground of the land of Israel, the mountain ridge, by cutting across to Ai and then heading south and north. Which brings us to the psukim here. And I want to highlight several textual problems that have a simple solution, but we need to see it, we need to notice it, and it will become important for us moving forward. The first is to ask the question, how much of the land of Israel is actually conquered? So if I read the psukim here, it says, Vayikach Yehoshua et kol haaretz. Yehoshua conquers the entire land. K'chol asher diber Hashem al Moshe, vayitna Yehoshua lenachala l'Yisrael, and he gives it as an inheritance for tribal division. Ve'aretz shakta mimilchama. The land is quieted from war. That sounds like Yeshua's campaign is over and he's conquered the entire land. The problem is, all we have to do is read 2 chapters later. In the opening of Parak Yud Gimel, Yeshua Zaken B'Habayamim. Yeshua is old, and God says to him, V'yomer Hashem alav, Ata zakanta, v'ha'aretz nish'ara harbe me'od l'mishtab. The land remains very much unconquered. So I have a direct contradiction between chapter 11 and chapter 13. And the text goes on to list all the places that are yet unconquered. Zot ha'aretz hanisheret kol glulot ha'plishtim, kol ha'geshuri, the Plishtim, the land of Geshur. Wait a second, land of Geshur, we talked about that. Min ha'shichor shofnei Mitzrayim, ad gvul hakron tzafona, all of this land along the coast. Miteman kol eretz ha'knaani, all of the Canaanite lands, ve'eretz ha'givli, V'chol ha'Levanon, all of the Lebanon, all of this green is still Canaanite. Well, wait a second. So what does it mean when it says, the last pasuk of Parak Yud Aleph, V'yikach Yehoshua et kol haaretz? A direct contradiction between chapter 11 and chapter 13. The other contradiction that's alluded to here is the speed of the campaign. Whereas here it says that the campaign was quick. The campaign even though it says Yamim Rabbi Masay Yeshua Kol HaMelachim Ha'elim Mechama, Yeshua waged this war, and there was nobody who made peace, and it was one battle after another, and there was Yericho, and there was Ai, and there was the south, and there was the north, and by the time you know it, 4 chapters later, we're done. Versus what we just described in chapter 13, which was, sorry, did I close that off? Yeshua Zaken, Baba Yamim, and the land is still unconquered, and there's a process, and it's going to take hundreds of years. I mean, this is the land that's unconquered, and this is the land, the orange is the land that's conquered. It's going to take hundreds of years to finally conquer the entire region. It's not going to happen until the days of Shaul and David. 400 years of Sefer Shoftim still. So where is this? How do we resolve this contradiction? And finally, the last contradiction is who was conquered. Because the psukim here make it very clear, that the only city that made peace with Israel was the Givonim. Other than the Givonim, Yehoshua conquered and destroyed all the nations of Canaan. Yehoshua, and he destroyed the Anakim. There was nobody left. The entire land was conquered. All the Canaanites were conquered. Really? All the Canaanites were conquered. So who are the Plishtim and who are the Canaanites? So who is Chatzor? Yavin Melech Chatzor, Melech Knaani Yoshev Chatzor, the Canaanite king of Yavin of Chatzor, who sends Sisra to fight against Barak in Sefer Shoftim. All the Canaanites are conquered. What about this pasuk in Sefer Melachim? I'll pull it up here. It'll just be faster. Kol ha'am anotar min ha'emori, ha'chiti, ha'pizi, ha'chivi, va'yevusi. All these nations, Amorites and Hittites and Perizzites and Hivites and Jebusites, all of these nations that not b'nei Israel, b'nehem asher notru achreihem ba'aretz. These were nations that were left in the land. Asher lo yochlu b'nei Israel lachimem, that Israel could not conquer. And Shlomo Melech places them some kind of tributary tax over them and role, which we'll talk about Bezrat Hashem one day when we look at Sefer Malach. So all the nations of Canaan were conquered, and yet not. There's a glaring contradiction in all of it. So what's the resolution? The resolution is really very simple, but we have to understand that that's the core of the message between the end of Perek Yud Aleph, which is the end of the first half of the Sefer, and the beginning of Perek Yud Gimel, which is the second half of the Sefer. In every military campaign, there are always 2 stages to every war. Stage 1 is strategic control and victory over the military victory over your enemy. Stage 2 is much more complicated, because stage 2 is to actually inherit and settle the land that was conquered in the first place. And that's a much more difficult task. That's exactly the challenge that was placed before Yehoshua. Yehoshua was told, conquer the land, and he does. And he conquers it quickly, and he takes the entire land, and he gains strategic control over the entire land. These are all the different mountain regions in the land. These are all the Canaanite nations that Yehoshua conquers, engages in military conquest, and defeats the enemy. And he does so. From this vantage point in Gilgal, Yehoshua now controls militarily the entire region. But that's not the goal. The goal is not to sit in Gilgal. The first part of the story has to take place with an entire army of Israel, fighting as one. They're fighting against the enemies of Canaan, and they defeat them. But that's only part 1 of the process. Part 2 of the process is much more complex, and it's alluded to in the last sentence of Perek Yud Aleph. Vayitna Yehoshua lenachala liYisrael kimachlokotam lishivtehem, as an inheritance division by their tribes. Part 2 of the campaign is for every tribe to go and settle in its territorial region. And when we start to look at the beginning of Perek Gimel, and we talk about the parts of the land that are left unconquered, Zot Haaretz and Ishara, and Yeshua's response to it is all the places that they didn't conquer, which we'll talk about when we get to that parak. First talks about the 2.5 tribes, which is not our issue for now. In Perek Yidale, Ela Asher Nachalu Bnei Yisrael Be'eretz Canaan. These are the nations that were the tribes that were given areas in the land of Canaan, and it starts to divide the land and by tribe, and it gets to a point where Yehoshua has to send out not spies but messengers to go and divide the land by Goral, and that's exactly what he has to do. One second, even here. He gives you Sefer Yehuda and their land. I'm looking for. He sends messengers out literally to the entire land, and he says, "Go and Vayom Yehoshua b'nei Yisrael ad ana atem mitrapim lavo leveshet taretz." How long are you going to wait? How long are you going to slack off to go and settle your land? Have lechem shlosha anashim l'shavet. Give me 3 people per tribe. Veshlachem v'yakumu v'yitachu ba'aretz. Let them go and let them walk through the land. V'yichtavu ota lefi nachalatam, and divide up each tribe where they're supposed to live, and then go and settle. And the 7 tribes will go and take their land. There were 7 remaining because Yudin was already done. So, Perek Chet, we have to wait to chapter 18 for Yehoshua finally to get the Israelite, the tribes, to move and to go and settle their land. It's one thing to conquer the land; it's another thing to settle it, and that's the challenge of the second half of Yehoshua. To do so, what Yeshua is going to have to do, one of the most dramatic moves he's going to make in the entire book, which is to break up the camp at Gilgal and move the Mishkan to Shiloh, because the Mishkan had been in Gilgal all this time. All of this is part of the effort to push the tribes to settle in their region, in their land, in their tribes, as the Sefer then continues. So what we've reached is a transition point in the Sefer. Up to chapter 11, Yehoshua leads a national army. From this point forward, he's going to transfer the leadership of the military to each tribe and say to you, you go and finish conquering and settling in the land and settle in the region that God has given you by Goral. And so the role of Yehoshua will diminish. The army he's going to try to break up and force and push each tribe to settle in its territory. The head of a tribe in Chumash is called a Nasi. In Sefer Yehoshua and in Sefer Shoftim, the head of a tribe is no longer called a Nasi. The head of the tribe is a military role, and he's called a leader of a tribe. If the word is shevet, is a tribe, the leader of the tribe is called a shovet, or as it's referred to in Nach, the shovet becomes known as a shofet, and hence the book of Shoftim. It's not about judges, it's about military leaders by tribe and region, called the Shofet or Shovet, from the word Shevet. That's the campaign moving forward. And if it took 7 years to conquer the land, it's going to take the tribes of Israel 400 years till the time of Shaul and David to finally essentially settle the land. That's the challenge moving forward. That's what we're going to see in the second half of the book. It's going to take us much less time to go through those chapters because we're going to do them in sections, kind of broad sections. I'm not going to go through the list of all the names of all of the tribal regions, etc. There's about 5 or 6 chapters just of maps. We're going to do it very quickly, and my goal is to kind of reach that chapter 18 point and then go from there till the end of the Sefer. That will take us to the second half of the book, and that's where we're at today.
Thank you, Rabbi.
My pleasure.
Safe trip.
Thank you very much. Safe
You're
travel.
welcome. Let me respond
Thank you very much, ובהצלחה.
Let me respond to one comment that came on the chat, which is that about the shofet versus shoftim. That is exactly the reason I said what I said. There is a fundamental difference between the shoftim of the book of Shoftim and the shoftim of the parsha of Shoftim and Chumash. They're even spelled differently. Okay, one's with a vav, one's without a vav. They're different words. The shoftim in Sefer Parshat Shoftim is about a Sanhedrin, it's about judiciary. The shofet in Sefer Shoftim has nothing to do with judiciary. Maybe the one exception being Devorah. We'll talk about it when we get there. It's about a military leader of a tribe. It's the replacement of what the Chumash calls a nasi. And I heard this once from Rav Yoel. It just makes so much sense. It's a completely different model and completely different concept. The word, unfortunately, gets kind of borrowed because shovet becomes a shofet just because of the way language transitions. But they actually have nothing in common with the judicial role of Parshat Shoftim. So that's
But in English, they translate it as judges.
yeah, they missed this
That's
point.
the problem.
Yeah, they missed this point.
בספר שופטים הם לא שופטים, הם
Thank you so
מסייעים
much.
ומגינים.
My pleasure.
הם מסייעים, הם מגינים, הם לא שופטים.
Yeah, there's a transition. Language changes, words change. And that's true in every language. So that's it. And when we get to Sefer Shoftim, we'll explore that again in more detail. But thank you all for listening. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you, B'ezrat Hashem, next week. We'll look at chapter 12.
Thank you.
Can I have a
Toda
question?
Rabah.
Yeah. Is there a question?
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah.
So they're going back to where the army base is, and then he sends them off. Joshua sends them off to. So they were that innumerous, lack of numbers, that they could all be in that one place, or in that. I mean,
I don't have an answer
need
to that
the
question.
land. It sounded like.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that question because it doesn't talk about the numbers. But it's clear that the Machaneh is in Gilgal. That's clear.
And then what is the implication of what Joshua conquered till the end of chapter 11 for what's considered to be Kedushat Eretz Yisrael? Is it confined to his initial, or are there people who say
I think that continues throughout the Sefer, but Kitcher Rishona is more complicated because it includes not only Yehoshua, it also includes David Melech and others. I don't have a definitive answer to that question.
Fair enough. And with God being in the picture, you have the contrast between the 70 turning into 600,000 in either 210 years or whatever, and the 600,000 remaining 600,000 when God's watching looking over their shoulders. If they would have increased in the 40 years like they did before, it would have been a lot larger number. So that's part of your point.
Maybe. Interesting. All right. Have a wonderful afternoon or evening. Take care.
Have a good trip.
Thank you. Thank you very much.